You know, as the leader of Victoria, Premier Andrews' job was a pretty simple one. It was to steer a path through a crisis that had engulfed the state. It was a crisis, all right, no doubt about that, but it was no different to any of those other crises faced by any state or territory in Australia, or any country for that matter around the globe that had been exposed to the pandemic. And yet, he has failed us. Daniel Andrews has failed to lead decisively and safely. Think about this. As the rest of Australia moves back to some form of normality after months of restrictions, Victoria is in lockdown. In fact, Victoria's position is now perilous. And yet in March, Victorians well understood the measures that the Premier was taking to protect them, their jobs and the economy. And what did they do? Well, they rallied behind him. We were all compliant because we believed that his leadership around how to tackle COVID would work. Yes, he had an unenviable job. He had to balance the pressures of the economy and secure it in what was a precarious environment. Made all the more difficult, of course, by the fact that there was so much uncertainty. The community followed him, though, and the decisions that he was compelled to make at the time were understood. It wasn't a cross that they all had to bear alone. Victorians were on board. Furthermore, as we had been told on so many occasions in the early days of the pandemic, we were going through unprecedented times. His leadership early in the year, no doubt about it, had been exemplary. But this effort of late, now this is a very different story. 4 months on, after all that the Victorians have had to endure, they suddenly find themselves left alone like a bit of a shag on a rock, an annex from the rest of the country. We are suddenly a pariah and a bit of a joke to the rest of the world. The adage, a week is a long time in politics, is a saying that I have no doubt Daniel Andrews is awfully familiar with, especially over the past 6 weeks, because it must seem to him like a road littered with failure and mismanagement. Daniel Andrews as Premier has failed Victorians because rather than direct the orchestra, he's allowed the orchestra to direct him and thereby failing all Victorians. Situations he should have controlled better, he hasn't. The strategy he's taken hasn't worked. And he's steered us through dangerous waters that suddenly see us running adrift. Victoria's hull has, metaphorically speaking, been ripped apart, and Daniel Andrews has morphed into the ghost of that captain, Captain Edward Smith, the man on the Titanic. And Victoria could well be his Titanic. It really is hard to fathom how, in just 6 weeks, the Premier's conservative and steady approach suddenly changed, and they saw him steer a different course, one that has left the state listing badly. From this distance, it appears that Premier Andrews has allowed himself to be dictated to by the unions who are striving to remain relevant. Daniel Andrews has failed Victoria because he took his foot off the brake way too early when there was no need to. Now, in earlier editorials this year that I've delivered on the Informer, I've stated time and time again why the Premier has needed to continue his conservative approach. He needed to be mindful of what had happened to Singapore and Korea when they took the brakes off too early. What did he do? He didn't listen. Instead, he allowed himself to be caught up in the rush to suddenly ease restrictions and get Victoria running again. He allowed the unions to dictate the enforcement of quarantine by, now as we've found out, unskilled and unqualified MSS security guards. Now that was something that should have been left to the members of the military or Victoria Police. But the Premier refused, and he opted instead to let the unions feather their nest. What followed, we're hearing allegations of sex and fraternising, the sharing of lighters and cigarettes, which contributed to this mess that we're now facing. Most of the other states, or the territories, whether they were Liberal or Labor, had opted for either the military approach or the police approach. So why was Victoria behaving differently? And you add to that the sea to meat saga. First, there was the initial secrecy surrounding a coronavirus outbreak at the plant. Then, the move by the government to instruct the company that it would appoint a former Health Department communications manager to handle the narrative on behalf of the government, rather than have it accept key strategic advice from other professionals. Cedar Meats saw the situation that it had at hand suddenly spiral out of control. It was a decision that carried with it the stench of a cover-up. Now, trying to control the narrative has ended up very much to the detriment of the company. The Premier, on top of that, compromised the safety of all Victorians. Now, the Black Lives Matters rally, yes, Black lives do matter. They matter greatly. But so do the lives of every Victorian. The rally could have been held at another time. But Daniel Andrews, once again, did something that was unfathomable. He allowed it to go ahead. Once again, it was a rally orchestrated by the unions, dictating to the Premier what they wanted to happen. Why? And let's not forget the media, which has also played a role in this crisis. And it continues to underperform. Now, we well know it's not what it once was. It operates very much today on a shoestring budget compared to the glory days when the newsrooms were filled with hardened professionals who understood how to cope with just about any emergency. The racial profiling was seen of 3,000 residents in the Housing Commission flats of Flemington, North Melbourne, by the media was racist. It was cultural abuse, shameful. And why was it just the residents of those two housing communities that were, held up? What about all those of equal standing in, say, Richmond, Collingwood, Brunswick, Toorak, that could have been opted to be locked down as well? They too house the state's most vulnerable, as we keep hearing, along with sharing common lifts and foyers that also applies to the apartment living too. Now, without warning last Saturday, those residents were treated as though they were criminals, even lepers. They were locked down with restrictions far greater than stage 3. I'm sorry, the narrative the Premier provided, along with his increasingly inept Minister for Health, Jenny Mikakos, and his top health official, Brett Sutton, was that these people were the most vulnerable in Victoria. But when did the government discover they were the state's most vulnerable? Was it during COVID-19? I think the answer is no. The people who live in community housing have always been vulnerable. And again, it begs the question, if the government knew they were vulnerable, why didn't they act months ago to assist, to provide the residents with the sort of access to hand sanitisers and the appropriate information? And in fact, go one step further, work with the community leaders about the importance of hygiene and safety. It's wrong, Mr. Premier, to racially profile ethnic communities through ignorance and arrogance. It's wrong, Mr. Premier, to shift the blame on Victorians and say the spread has occurred because of your complacency. Mr. Premier, the spread has occurred because of the reasons we've outlined a little earlier, not because of the Muslim or South Sudanese or any other community for that matter, but because of your policy making on the run. The incompetence that has been shown by both the Minister for Health and your Chief Health Professional, Brett Sutton, along with you. Yes, the buck stops with you, Mr. Premier, but Mikakos and Sutton are very culpable too. You are the elected officials charged with managing the state, and during this crisis, that's the one thing you haven't done. The time has come to sack both Mikakos and Sutton.